Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. I have really enjoyed everything. I wish that Rick Aguilera's message could be on television for everybody to see. It's very, very impressive. But I've decided to entitle my talk this evening, Frontal Lobes. Now, you know, if you look at all the animals that were created, the ones with the biggest frontal lobes are us, human beings. Everybody else has these relatively small frontal lobes. Why are ours so big? Because that's the part of the brain that allows you to engage in rational thought processing. We're the only creatures who have the ability to extract information from the past and the present, project it into a plan, and thereby fashion your own future. And that's because we were made in the image of God. Now, you know, this whole creation evolution controversy has been raging on really since the beginning. Because what is Satan's plan? To get rid of God, to disparage God, to mischaracterize God. And what is creation? Creation is God's signature, that He created the world and that He created us. You know, this past spring, I was involved in a little bit of controversy at one of the universities, Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. I was invited to be the commencement speaker. And some of the biology professors heard that I was coming, and they became quite agitated. They were very upset. Started a petition. Did you know that this man believes in creation? How can someone who believes in creation give a commencement address at a university? They thought that was just ridiculous. Interestingly enough, as some of you might know, Emory University has its roots as a Methodist university. At any rate, you know, they started a petition. 500 people signed a petition. And then a counter petition was started. And over 2,200 people signed that. But, you know, the interesting thing is, they said that I said that people who believed in evolution were unethical. And that's not what I said at all. What I said is that people who believe in God and who believe in the Bible can very easily explain from where they derive their ethical philosophies. People who believe in survival of the fittest might have a more difficult time doing that. Because when you believe in survival of the fittest, and you and another person are the only person there, and you're hungry, and you kill them and eat them, well, you know, that's survival of the fittest. That's not necessarily the wrong thing to do. And if you believe as we do, and we get our ethical considerations from God, that would not even be a consideration. So there is a tendency sometimes for the politically correct crowd to reinterpret things according to their own philosophies. You know, political correctness and evolution is part of scientific political correctness. You're not supposed to believe in God. You know, I remember one of the very interesting times I had is I was invited to be the keynote speaker for the National Society of Science Teachers. 15,000 science teachers at the Philadelphia Convention Center. And I decided to talk about evolution and creation. Well, you would be amazed at how many science teachers actually believe in creation. Many of them actually, I got so many letters and emails who said, you know, this is what I believe too, but I'm just afraid to say it. And, you know, the politically correct crowd in academia is extremely domineering and intolerant of anybody who believes anything different than they do. And if you're a young assistant professor at a major university and you're trying to be promoted and you indicate that you believe in creation, you're in big trouble. There's a very strong chance that you will not be promoted. And in fact, you may well be driven out of the university. Extraordinarily intolerant. And, you know, that's one of the things about PC, and it's one of the reasons that I rail against political correctness so much. You know, people just listen for things that they can be critical of. I remember once I was talking to an audience about the difference between a human brain and a dog's brain. And a man got offended. He said, "You can't talk about dogs like that." You know, people just, you know, they grab onto things and, you know, they start saying, no, 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 no. I was talking to a group about how the fashion industry has gotten the young ladies to think they're supposed to be so skinny they look like they escaped from a concentration camp. And a Jewish man got offended. He said, "You can't mention concentration camps. That's way too sensitive. It would be as if I said something to you about slavery." And I said, "You can talk about slavery all you want. It doesn't bother me." But, you know, some people just seize upon things and then they can't hear anything else. And, you know, they try to create a big deal out of it. And really, that's what PC does. And if you really stop and think about the founding of this nation, many people came here from other parts of the world because they were trying to escape from people who told them what they could think and what they could say. And here we come reintroducing it through the back door, and it's every bit as malignant as before. Well, I've had an opportunity to be involved in some public discussions with a lot of people in the scientific arena, including the father of artificial intelligence at MIT, before a group of students, and you know, he just couldn't understand how I could believe in God as a scientist. And we had quite an argument. And he could not refute any of my arguments. And finally, he just said, "You're a religious bigot." And he walked away. You know, they resort to calling people names. I was once in a public debate with Richard Dawkins, who's probably the world's foremost atheist, and Daniel Dennett from Tufts University, and we were having a debate about faith and science. And those two were on one side, and on my side was me and Francis Collins, who's the director of the National Institutes of Health, who started out his career, by the way, as an atheist. And as he learned more and more about the human genome, as you know, he was one who spearheaded the Human Genome Project. He said, "Wait a minute, this was no accident." You know, as he looked at the sophistication of those codes. I mean, how many people would look at a computer and look at a computer program and say that it's just random, it just happened? And yet, you know, you take a program like C++ and, you know, a series of zeros and ones can create all kinds of sophisticated commands that a computer can execute. Well, you know, when you look at the genome, you take a series of 4 repeating nucleic acids, which create a template that tells you whether you have a man or a giraffe or an algae or a Drosophila, and what kind of one of those it will be. And it is infinitely more complex than the C++ program for a computer. And that's what Francis Collins recognized as he was becoming the leading authority in this. And it became absolutely clear to him that evolution, in that sense, even if he does believe in a type of evolution, he said it had to have a creator. And interestingly enough, Daniel Dennett and Richard Dawkins, they were just outraged that Francis Collins and myself believed in God. And they said, you know, you can't be a real scientist and believe in that. If you believe in God, you believe in the flying spaghetti monster. You know, they were throwing out all these disparaging remarks. And at the end of the discussion, I said, "You've convinced me of one thing, And that is, I came from God and you came from a monkey. At which time the audience exploded, and that was the end of the conversation. But I also had an opportunity to have a debate publicly with Don Johanson, the famous archaeologist who discovered Lucy. He's an anthropologist, the so-called missing link. And, he shows this all over the world, this little skull with a protruding mandible and a receding forehead. And I said, I'm a neurosurgeon. And I operate on a lot of people who have, deformed skulls and things. And, eventually they die and they get buried. And years later, somebody like you comes along and finds their skull and said they found a missing link, He didn't appreciate that. But I said, why is there just one of them? Why isn't there a whole colony of them? How can you dig up this one little thing and then extrapolate? And that's what those who are creationists tend to do, make these gigantic extrapolations without real evidence of what's going on. But I think perhaps the most important evidence for the existence of God is what happens in our own lives, our own personal experience with God. There is nothing in any book or any university that compares with your own personal experience. I remember some years ago I was asked if I would come to South Africa to head up a team in an attempt to separate type 2 vertical craniopagus twins. Siamese twins joined at the top of the head facing in opposite directions. And there had been 13 attempts to separate twins like that before, none of which had been successful. So I knew it was going to be a great medical challenge. It was going to be, a big social challenge too, because the operation was going to be done at the Medical University of South Africa at Medinsa, the major black teaching hospital, always the stepchild throughout apartheid and the post-apartheid period. This was going to be their chance to stand shoulder to shoulder with Cape Town, Johannesburg, all the other great universities. And I wasn't ready for all that social pressure, and I said, Lord, you're going to have to show me something here. And as I studied the anatomy, it became clear to me that the common drainage system that they shared was narrow centrally. And the traditional neurosurgical literature says you should decide which twin to give the drainage system to and then divide them over the course of a number of operations divided in time by several weeks to several months to allow them to develop collateral circulation. Well, I felt impressed that we could do it in one operation if we concentrated on the area where the vessels were narrowing down, because other vessels would dilate up around those as soon as you took them. And when I explained that to the team, they said, you're the boss, we'll do whatever you want to do. And I remember going to that operating room 2 days before New Year's of '98, big sign over the operating room, God bless Joseph and Luca Banda. And they were having song service and prayer service, and I was thrilled. And I said, can we bring in a stereo system to play inspirational music? 19 hours into the operation, we were only 3/4 of the way finished. The part that remained was so complex. The blood vessels were engorged, adhesed, entangled. It looked impossible. And I thought about the first set of twins that I was involved in and how we used 60 units of blood. And the second set, 80 units of blood. And as I looked at that complex, I said, there's not enough blood in South Africa to get through this. And we stopped the operation. We went into conference. I suggested maybe we could cover the area over with skin and then come back. And they will have developed enough collaterals that we could now cut through those vessels. And the doctors from South Africa and Zambia said, it's a great idea. Well, I know it would work at Johns Hopkins, but we don't have the ability to keep partially separated twins alive. They'll die. And now I really felt like I had the weight of the world on my shoulders. I didn't have all my fancy equipment. I had my surgical loops, my scalpel, and a prayer on my lips. And I said, Lord, it's up to you. And I went in there and started cutting between those blood vessels that were so thin. You could see the anesthetic bubbles coursing through, just daring you to make a nick in them. And, you know, it's like trying to untangle a bowl of spaghetti. And I just kind of zoned out. I don't even remember what I was doing, to be honest with you. But all the other neurosurgeons afterwards said, we couldn't believe what you were doing. But when I made the final cut that separated those twins, over the stereo system came the Hallelujah Chorus. And everybody had goosebumps. And when we finished that operation, after 28 hours, one of the twins popped his eyes open and reached up for the endotracheal tube. The other one did the same thing. By the time we got to the ICU, within 2 days they were extubated. Within 2 weeks they were crawling. And today they're in the 10th grade. But, and interestingly enough, the operation required 3 units of blood. So that's what happens when God takes over. And see, I know that because I was there. And I saw those vessels. And I said, oh my, there is no way in the world. And yet, he did it. And it's the first time twins like that have ever been separated and remained intact neurologically. So, you know, that kind of experience is very hard to find in a textbook or any other place except in your own personal lives. But we all have experiences like that. And that's what faith is made of. We have to think about those experiences that occur in our lives. You know, I remember another time when we had built the home that we thought was our final home in Howard County. And then all the farmers around there started selling their property and putting all these developments in. And we said, oh, gosh, we need to move. So we bought a farm with lots of acreage so that could never happen again. But the problem was we couldn't sell our other house. And I said, Lord, I pay my tithe. And, you know, I do all this stuff. So how come we can't sell this house? Every time we would get a contract on it and it looked promising, and then it would fall through. For 5 years. It stayed on the market for 5 years. And it was during the time when the housing bubble was going on. Houses were being bought and sold like crazy. The prices were escalating. I have a very good friend. He's a real estate developer. He develops real estate all over the country. And he was trying to find a piece of real estate for me to invest in that would be perfect, that I wouldn't have to invest any time in, that would provide a good income. And he looked for years, and he couldn't find a perfect thing. And then another friend told me about something called a 1031 exchange, where if you sell a piece of property and you get excess profit from it, and you can roll it over into another property within 45 days of the time that you sell it, then you don't have to pay excessive taxes on it. Well, wouldn't you know, he found the perfect property just after I found out about the 1031 exchange, and within 45 days, the house sold for more than twice as much as we had put it on the market for before. So there I was sitting there accusing God of not blessing me, when in fact he was blessing me far beyond what I thought. And, you know, it's those kinds of personal experiences that I think make all the difference in the world. But why is it that people try so hard to get rid of God? You know, you go back to the very first chapter in the Bible. And, you know, I'm not a hard and fast person who says the earth is only 6,000 years old. But I do believe in the six-day creation. And because, you know, it says in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. Doesn't say when he created them except for in the beginning. So the earth could have been here for a long time before he started creating things on it. But when he did start doing that, he made it very specifically clear to us. The evening and the morning were the next day. Because he knew that people would come along and try to say that, oh, it was millions and millions of years. And then what else did he say in the very first chapter? That each thing brought forth after its own kind. Because he knew people would come along and say, you know, this changed into that, and this changed into that, and this changed into that. So at the very beginning of the Bible, he puts that to rest. And, you know, as was pointed out already tonight, you know, people try to disparage the Bible, say that these things are not true, these are fanciful tales. And yet, there's abundant evidence, geological evidence, that there was a worldwide flood. Go up to the Andes Mountains and see all those fossils on the top of those mountains. I mean, these things, when you talk to the evolutionists about them, they always say the same thing. Well, we don't understand everything. And I just say, I'm not sure you understand anything. You know, they look at all those layers, and then they find some fossils in one of the layers, and they says, this fossil is this many years old because it's in this layer. So that means this fossil is like 1,000,000 years old. And then later on they say, well, this layer is 1,000,000 years old because this fossil, which is 1,000,000 years old, is in it. You know, that's like saying, you know, the sky can be red or blue. And you say, well, the sky is blue. And you say, why is it blue? Because it's not red. Well, why is it not red? Because it's blue. You know, that's known as circular reasoning. That's how they explain the age of all these things. It's very circular reasoning, and really it has no real scientific validity. But the real linchpin of evolution is natural selection. And of course, that's a term coined by Charles Darwin. And many people don't know this, but Charles Darwin actually started out in a seminary to become a man of the cloth. He had some experiences with God that didn't go his way, like his 10-year-old daughter who died of pneumonia despite his pleas. But, you know, he goes off to the Galapagos Islands. And he was a very keen observer. I will give him credit. And he noticed some things that you didn't seem to see anyplace else. He particularly noticed the finches there who had these elongated, thickened beaks. And he said, no other finches have beaks like this. This is evidence of evolutionary change. Now, what he didn't know is that there had been severe droughts in the Galapagos for 3 years. The only finches that survived were the ones that had thick beaks that could break open the seedlings and extract the nutrition, and they were able to breed and pass that trait on to the next. But evolutionists say that those changes that you see, just like you saw with all the dogs, is definitive proof of evolution. Now, I submit that changes can occur within a species. But is that a sign of evolution? Or is it a sign of an intelligent creator who gave his creatures the ability to adapt to their environment so that he wouldn't have to start over every 50 years? You know, that sounds much more intelligent than anything else. And no one has ever demonstrated one species changing to another species. And, you know, this should be, if it's true, a continual evolving. So we should be able to find intermediate species at any given point in time. And we should be able to find how they line up. You know, Darwin said his whole theory depended on the fossil remains. And he said we should be able to line up from a single cell organism to man several miles long and just walk right down the fossil trail and see how everything evolved. And he said the only reason they didn't have the fossils is because they were not geologically sophisticated enough, but that we would be in 50 to 100 years. Well, that was 150 years ago. We still haven't found them. Where are they? Where are the fossil remains? Well, when you ask the evolutionists about that, they say, I don't know where they are. They're somewhere. We just haven't found them yet. You know, that's a pretty lame excuse, to be honest with you. But, you know, the interesting thing about evolution, about natural selection, is that it claims that anything that isn't useful disappears. So while a species is in the process of changing, it clings on to those things that allow it to thrive, and those things that are not useful disappear. So if that's the case, why do we have kidneys? Because kidney has many components. You know, the glomerulus and renal tubules and all kinds of epithelial surfaces, all of which work together to be able to filter blood, create urine. It's a complex process. None of those things in and of themselves have any purpose. Same thing with your eye. You have an iris and a pupil and a cornea and vitreous, and, you know, retina, rod cells, and cone cells, all of which are necessary for the eye to function. Short ciliary nerves. Now, without the other parts, it doesn't work. So how did it get there? Did a cone cell, which is sophisticated in and of itself, just kind of sit around for a few million years waiting for a rod cell? And then they sit around waiting for a retinal network? You know, according to the theory, it had to go poof, and there was an eyeball overnight, just like that, because it wouldn't work in any other way. And when you ask the evolutionists about that, they say, well, we don't understand everything. And I say, well, I don't think you understand anything. Because then you go to the brain. I mean, the human brain, the most sophisticated organ system in the universe. Billions and billions of neurons, hundreds of billions of interconnections. It remembers every single thing you have ever seen. Every single thing you have ever heard. Can process more than 2 million bits of information in 1 second. I mean, it is unbelievable. Some people say, well, you shouldn't learn this, you shouldn't learn this because you'll overload your brain. Have you ever heard anybody say that? Now, what a bunch of nonsense that is. Do you know your brain, and this is a conservative estimate, could take in one new fact every second for over 3 million years before you begin to challenge its capacity. So don't let anybody tell you that you can overload your brain. And that's our brains in their degenerated state. Can you imagine what they were like before? Unbelievable. Because we're made in the image of God. How many people here remember your birthday? Okay, I think it's unanimous. What did your brain have to do for you to respond to that question? Well, first of all, the sound waves had to leave my lips, travel through the air, enter your external auditory meatus, travel down to your tympanic membrane, set up a vibratory force, which travel across the ossicles of the middle ear to the over and round window, setting a vibratory force in the inner lip, which mechanically distorted the microcilia, converting mechanical energy to electrical energy, which traveled across the cochlear nerve to the cochlear nucleus at the pontomedullary junction, from there to the superior olivary nucleus, sitting bilaterally at the brainstem to the laminiskis, to the inferior colliculus, and the medial geniculate nuclei, across the thalamic radiations to the posterior temporal lobes, beginning an auditory process, processes. From there to the frontal lobes, coming down to tractive victors, you're retrieving the memory from the medial hippocampal structure of the memory bodies back to the frontal lobes to start the motor response at the bet cell level. Coming down the cortical spinal tract, across the internal capsule into the cerebral peduncle, descending down to the cervical medullary decussation, into the spinal cord gray matter, synapsing there, going out to the neuromuscular junction, stimulating the nerve and the muscle. So you can raise your hand. And that's the simplified version of what your brain had to do. See if you can get one of those rap singers to do that. But, you know, but if your brain can do that and you barely even had to think about it, what is your brain capable of if you actually put your mind to something? And someone wants to tell me that that came from a slime pit with a bunch of promiscuous biochemicals? Give me a break. You know, that really stretches the limits of credulity. Well, now what about the Big Bang theory? I find the Big Bang really quite fascinating. I mean, here you have all these highfalutin scientists, and they're saying that there was this gigantic explosion and everything came into perfect order. Now, these are the same scientists who go around touting the second law of thermodynamics, which is entropy, which says that things move toward a state of disorganization. So now you're going to have this big explosion and everything becomes perfectly organized. And when you ask them about it, they say, well, we can explain this based on probability theory, because if there's enough big explosions over a long enough period of time, over billions and billions of years, one of them will be the perfect explosion. And I say, so what you're telling me is if I blow a hurricane through a junkyard enough times, over billions and billions of years, eventually after one of those hurricanes, there'll be a 747 fully loaded and ready to fly. Well, but I mean, it's even more ridiculous than that, because our solar system, not to mention the universe outside of that, is extraordinarily well organized to the point where we can predict 70 years away when a comet is coming. Now, that type of organization to just come out of an explosion, I mean, you want to talk about fairy tales. That is amazing. And then even if you want to use their own scientific theories, you know, you've got this mass spinning and then it explodes. In physics, we have something we call angular momentum, and it is preserved. So it should be preserved in any orbit of anything that is affected by gravity around a planet, which means everything has to traverse in the same direction. Well, it doesn't. There are many planets that have satellites and moons that go in opposite directions. So that doesn't work with angular momentum. And there are a whole series of things. What about all the debris from the billions and billions of explosions that were not perfect? Where's that? I mean, we should have been bombarded constantly by all this debris coming down. We're not seeing it. So, you know, there's a lot of things there that really require an enormous amount of faith. And really what it boils down to is, where do you want to put your faith? In man or in God? Which one makes more sense? And I constantly say, you know, I'm a person of limited faith. I really don't have enough faith to believe that stuff that they say. I mean, that is really beyond belief in terms of the number of coincidences that have to occur and the number of things that have to violate even their own principles in order for it to work. And then here's what's also fascinating. This nation, the United States of America, one of the few nations in history to claim God in their founding documents. We talk about in our Declaration of Independence, certain inalienable rights given to us by our Creator. Every one of our coins Every one of our bills says, "In God we trust." Now I want you to think about something. This nation has had a profound effect on the world. Before the United States of America came on the scene, for 100 years, 200 years, 1,000 years, 3,000 years, people did things the same way. Crops ready, you put them on the cart, hooked up your mules, took them into town, sowed the crop. Within 200 years of the advent of this nation, which believed in God, men were walking on the moon. Completely revolutionized and changed the world because a nation was willing to acknowledge God. Now, as we are persistently making him unpopular, politically incorrect, to the point where, I mean, think about it. We're in a Christmas season. Most of us think twice now before we say Merry Christmas to somebody. This is where we have gone. We are trying to push him out, and look what's happening to our nation. I mean, the evidence is so clear. It's clear in our own lives. It's clear in our communities. It's clear in our nation. It's clear in our world. And the question is, are we going to use those frontal lobes? The reason he gave those to us is so that we could analyze all of this evidence, which is so clearly placed in front of us. You know, think about the beautiful flowers that we see. How are flowers able to reproduce? Pollination. How does pollination occur? Bees and other creatures. Now, according to evolution, plants came along before the bees. So, how do plants reproduce? And what about animals? And what about people and their reproduction? You know, it was a wonderful thing that God gave us. You know, men are attracted to women, women are attracted to men. Although that's changing in this society. But anyway, that was the way it was supposed to be, okay? And it was a beautiful thing. But according to evolutionary model, you know, we really came from an amoeba. And amoebas, they just like split, and then there's two amoebas. So it seems to me like according to the evolutionary model, you do things that are efficient. So rather than going out and looking for a mate, you would just divide, and there'd be two of you. And that'd be pretty horrible in some cases. But, you know, things are supposed to work in an efficient way. So according to the evolutionary model, we would be less pugilistic, and we'd be much more logical, we'd be much more creative, we wouldn't be going around fighting each other and cutting off people's heads anymore, because that stuff would have been extinguished and we would have evolved into something much better. According to the creation model, in which we have an adversary, it's very easy to explain. Why people act that way is because they have choice and because there is an adversary out there. So again, these are things where we're using that logic. We're looking at the two different points of view. How are things done? And we are the ones who get to make the choice. But I think the most powerful evidence is the fact that we are creative. The fact that we are compassionate. And the fact that we can manifest love. Where did that come from? In the evolutionary model. Why is it somebody's drowning? For the most part, you're not just going to walk by. You're going to try to throw them something. If you can swim, you're going to jump in and save. That doesn't work in the evolutionary model. Because the evolutionary model says survival of the fittest. You would just say, do that and just keep walking. Now, some people do that. But, you know, most people, they see somebody struggling, there's something inside of them that says, help. That makes no sense whatsoever in the evolutionary model. So we should be extraordinarily thankful for the example that has been given to us, for the fact that the creator of the universe, think about that power. Think about the expanse of the universe. It's mind-boggling whenever I start studying, you know, the cosmos and realize how tiny and insignificant we are. And yet, that he would send his only begotten Son to this place and all this magnitude, that the individual who created all this was willing to be spat upon, humiliated and crucified, tormented, because he loved us that much. That could happen on our behalves, and that we could manifest any doubt whatsoever would be pretty amazing. But I think we have all the evidence that we need, that we have a powerful, a loving God who will do anything for us except force us. Thank you very much.
We have time for a few questions. If you have questions for Dr. Carson, we'd like to entertain a question or two speaking to the issue of creation. Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask? Yes, young man.
Well, I don't get how, like, I mean, sometimes I should believe it that science way that people understand they created. But then, when I heard this, I was like, what's that true? The God way or the scientific way? I don't know.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Just in case you didn't hear that question was, sometimes it's really hard. When we're in school, and I remember this being the case when I was in school, Dr. Carson, we sit in science class and science promotes one way of thinking, and yet we hear a presentation like we've heard tonight and we hear a completely different way of thinking. What should we believe?
Well, first of all, I think it's quite evident from what you've seen tonight. It takes faith to believe in God. It takes faith to believe in evolution. I think it takes a lot more faith to believe in evolution than it does to believe in God. But they both require faith. And the fact of the matter is, they're both religion. And if we really were to put a litmus test on them, and we said we can't teach religion in school, we wouldn't be able to teach evolution either. But the fact of the matter is, we have to look at things based on what makes sense. And, you know, you look at the geological layers, it makes perfectly good sense that that was done by a worldwide flood. You look at the fact that there are crustaceans on the top of the Andes Mountains, it makes perfectly good sense that there was a flood. And, you know, it's really a matter, again, of using the frontal lobes, analyzing the stuff, seeing how it compares with what God has said, what man has says. You don't find inconsistencies with the way God said it. You find a lot of inconsistencies with the way man has said it.
Thank you very much. Yes, one other question here.
All the scientists accept evolution when it has not completed. All is still a theory. It is not a fact. It's not scientific fact.
Well, again, interestingly enough, this is a relatively modern science concept. Before Darwin came along, it wasn't. You know, scientists like Sir Isaac Newton, considered one of the most scientific minds ever, inventor of calculus, so many things. Strong belief in God, big mission outreach. Einstein, when you think about genius, what was the word would you come up with? Einstein. He believed in God. You know, a lot of people believed in God, but I personally believe that this theory that Darwin came up with was something that was encouraged by the adversary. And it has become what is scientifically, politically correct. Amazingly, there are a significant number of scientists who do not believe it, but they're afraid to say anything. And one of the things that I'm hoping to do over the next few years, one of the books coming up on my docket is called The Organ of Species. Not the origin of species, the organ of species. And we're going to talk about the organs of the body and how they completely refute evolution and several other things as well. So that people who are believers will have something they can grasp onto that is done in a way that's not too technical, because, you know, when you look at a lot of the creationist stuff, they use technical terms to define technical situations, and you don't know any more than you knew when you started reading them. So, you know, you have to break it all down so that people can have a really good understanding of it. And I think when there's a lot of people who have a good understanding of it and they can put up a decent argument, I think we'll begin to make some progress.
I see a young person with a hand right here. Final question for the evening. What's your question? Did you hear that question?
Repeat it.
Can you say it one more time, nice and strong?
If the evolution part was true, then how would they be able to evolve? Split apart?
So if that theory of evolution were true and people had to replicate by self-replication and splitting apart, how would that happen anyway?
Well, the way that would happen is through evolving the systems that allow you to split apart. Those systems have not been developed. They have not evolved, which means it's not true.
Let's give Dr. Carson a hand. With this presentation, we bring to a close our celebration of creation. And why do we have a celebration of creation? Because we believe that there's immense value in understanding our Creator. Our prayer for you is that you would develop a relationship with your Creator, to know your Creator more deeply. And through that creation and through that relationship, find hope for the future and hope that will extend into eternity.